Stating, prove to me that nothing bad ever happened in that school is one of the dumbest statements I have ever heard. Something bad happens in every school. The argument there is that schools in the 1800s deliberately removing kids from their parents, taking them in, there being abuse, mass disease, horrible conditions, is different from a school that is set up voluntarily for kids to go and stay there. But to compare that to the residential schools where children were being ripped away from their families is just not even on the same level, and I find that extremely disingenuous.
So if that's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life, you've lived a more privileged life than I thought possible. And I'm just going to say this, the burden of proof would then be upon you. If you're going to assert that this school doesn't really constitute a residential school because at the end of the day, nothing bad happened here related to the same systems in place from the other residential schools in Canada, then again, please demonstrate that with some kind of factual evidence.
I'm pretty sure your brain is running on 1995, okay? We're fucking 30 minutes into this goddamn debate talking about, like, I don't know, terms about fucking murder and descriptive reality and history and all that kind of shit. And you want to talk to Lauren about fucking GPR and whether or not she can offhand fucking come up with a new way to conduct anthropology? I don't give a shit. Fucking catch up. Because basically what you're doing right now is you're acting smarter than everybody else in the fucking room while saying absolutely fucking nothing. If you want to take your fucking galaxy brain fucking 10 head and your individual experience, then please educate us. But if I have to hear fucking Lauren's a dumbass about GPR one more fucking time for 35 fucking seconds, I'm gonna fucking lose it.
You declared that the Great Replacement Theory was one of the reasons why they committed the atrocity that they did. Afterwards, you then took everything back.
Pussy. You
Afterwards,
fucking pussy.
you
Bringing this
took
all
everything back.
up at the end so I don't have a chance to respond.
You can respond.
Wait.
I'm more than glad.
Lying.
More than glad. More than glad. I would love. Please bring it all up. Bring it all up, Lauren.
Wait. I would like to welcome everybody to this event. I was brought in about 2 days ago, but I'm happy to host it. It is going to be on a host of issues, many of them Canadian-centric. So as an American, I'm going to feel a little left out of the subject matter. Are bacon still better? I'm going to go over a few of the basic rules of my show. My show's a little different than most is because I'm a more of aggressive moderator than most. If people are interrupting too much, I will go in to make sure that people can clarify their positions and points. So if there is ever a point where I think there's too much chaos going on, I'm not going to let it be blood sporty. I will jump in to assert myself. When I am talking, it is not to make a point. I'm not going to randomly come in to make fun of Lauren Southern for playing League of Legends. I will just come in.
The worst thing I've done.
It is the worst thing you've done. So I am going to purely be moderating. Now, my rules include, of course, nothing against terms of service. I would like to keep my job. Please do not delete my job from the internet. The second rule is we will not be attacking people's immutable characteristics. So you will not be going after people's, whether they're a race, religion, anything of that sort. So if Lance wanted to make fun of Connor for his belief in whatever weird religions in Warhammer 40K, he cannot do that. It is not allowed. Another rule of mine is that no slurs are allowed on my show because I find them unpleasant and not productive for conversation. Are you allowed to make small jabs if you want to? Yes, but I would encourage you not to. I don't think it's productive, and I think it makes you look silly. So that's just my tip from me to you. Other than that, we will have a 2-minute intro and 2-minute outro segment. So if you prepared for a longer intro, you can use some of that prepared content for probably your outro. If you thought it was going to be 5 minutes, for example. Is there anything I'm missing from normal rules? Oh, one last thing. I have a chess timer. This is different from most debates where I will keep track of, I know it's of both sides, how much time they use. So if later in the discussion, people are trying to get in and I see that one time has gotten an inordinate amount of time in comparison to the other, I will make sure to give one side a few more speaking opportunities so we can balance it out more so each side is represented. Is there any questions about any of the rules that need to be clarified?
No.
Okay.
All good, Chief.
Wonderful. Did somebody just start streaming?
That's my fault.
Nope. No problem.
I have corrected.
So before we do the intros, I just want everybody to introduce themselves. I don't want to whittle down your time for your prepared statements. So I'm going to give it to Connor to introduce themselves and shout themselves out first.
Yeah, hi guys, my name's Connor. I identify as centrist or center-right. I'm a law enforcement veteran, a military veteran, and a science fiction, philosophy, and religion nerd. So if any of that interests you, you can just go into YouTube, type in Counterpoints Common Spelling. You can find my content there. That's pretty much it. So thank you for having me, Dylan. Thank you for hosting. I sincerely appreciate it.
Wonderful, no problem. I'm going to throw it over now to Lauren Southern.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I am a documentary filmmaker. My reputation probably precedes me in a lot of these circles, but if you only watch TheSerfs or maybe Dylan, you may have some opinions about me that aren't quite accurate, and I look forward to potentially presenting those in this debate. And thank you for having me, Dylan. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Now we're going to throw it over to Tale of Two Rabbits.
Actually, I'd prefer to let Lance go first.
Okay. Lance can go first.
Sure. Hey, I'm Lance of TheSerfs. I'm political dumpster fire, comedy garbage on the internet, and you can find me everywhere social media is sold.
Wonderful. Now we can throw it over to Tale of Two Rabbits.
Hello, my name is Tale of Two Rabbits here on Twitch. It is Twin Rabbit on YouTube. I tend to do mostly streaming of Let's Plays of games that are Indigenous and Indigenous adjacent. So either games that have been created by Indigenous authors and developers, or they contain a lot of Indigenous related themes. And on my Twitter, I shitpost. On my YouTube, the videos are a lot about Indigenous history, archaeology, and a little bit about video game history too.
Okay. Wonderful. Now we're going to go into prepared statements. Now let me clarify for the audience what we're going to be talking about today so there's no confusion. The topics that were given to me was that the debate will be primarily about retributive and vigilante justice for historical wrongs, and there might be some secondary discussions, if time permits it, about the recent burning of Catholic churches in Canada, the recent discovery of the unmarked Indigenous graves in the same nation, and the actions of the Canadian government in the past, if it could fall under the historical definition of genocide. Do we all agree on the discussed topics? There's no confusion?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Sounds
Okay,
good.
we will start with counterpoints with a prepared 2-minute statement. You will be timed, and I will give you a warning once you have about 20 seconds left.
Yeah, so in preparation for this debate, I think the primary thing that I landed on was the fact that burning churches is just unacceptable. I understand that there's a contentious history in Canada, but there's no real excuse for throwing a Molotov cocktail inside of a building. You can have descriptive reasons, much like riots. You can understand why something is going on, but you probably can't morally justify it. So that's the number one contention that I would have. Number two, when it comes to Indigenous history, I think that the audience will probably be surprised, or hopefully they're not surprised, that there is a lot of concession for the sins of the past and all of that kind of stuff, and we can get into that. I'm interested to talk about definitions because obviously the word genocide is being brought into this conversation, so I want to talk about that as an aspect of this. And then ultimately, I think this conversation is indicative of where we are at as a continent as a whole. Europeans conquered this continent, colonized this continent, and did some nefarious stuff in order to do that. We have done the sins in the past. Now we have to reckon with those sins and move forward as a society. So I'm hoping that we can kind of, even if it's very uncomfortable, even if it's contentious, I'm hoping that maybe we can do that here a little bit. And I'll leave it there and we can go.
Wonderful. With 48 seconds to spare. Now we're going to throw it over to Lauren Southern.
Hey, okay, so I've written a little something, haven't written anything else for the debate, but today we have framed this debate as a discussion, obviously, around retributive and vigilante justice, and whether or not Canada is guilty of genocide. But what we are debating in reality here is acts of political terrorism, the committing of hate crimes, the burning down of religious sites, including the recent burning down of refugee churches, and those who are hell-bent on making excuses for this behavior, all based on the recent discovery of mass graves of Indigenous children, which activists have portrayed as evidence of genocidal actions by the Canadian government, which were covered up. The only problem with this entire debate is, firstly, even if this happened and the Canadian government committed genocide, there would be no excuse to commit hate crimes today, especially against people who had no connection to said actions. And an equally important and shocking revelation should be is that no mass graves were found in the first place. This is an entirely false narrative. No one here today is going to deny historical injustices happened. No one is going to deny there were deliberately children taken from their homes and educated to no longer have their culture and language, and that is horrific. I don't think that should happen to anybody. However, distorting the past, exaggerating atrocities, inventing the existence of mass graves to make it appear as though Canada committed and covered up some sort of Holocaust is a horrific mishandling of the truth, and it does nothing to help us uncover and heal from genuine wrongdoings which occurred. And in fact, it has caused more trauma today for Canadians and Indigenous communities who are now seeing their communities destroyed, their churches burnt to the ground, and relations ripped apart even further.
Okay, 7 seconds to spare. We're now going to throw it over to Lance from TheSerfs.
Hey everybody, so I'm going to say right out of the gates that neither me or my partner support or condone the burning of any religious institutions. What we're here today to talk about is obviously restorative and retributive justice in relation to the residential school system in Canada and the involvement of the Catholic Church therein. I'm going to try and say this as quickly and concisely as I can. The original founding father of this country, Sir John A. Macdonald, was a white nationalist, and I don't mean that in the sense that lefties like to call every single person they don't like a Nazi. He was a person who believed in the superiority of the Aryan race. He said it frequently. He, in Parliament, would say things that were considered to be outlandish and racist by the sign of the times. And he started both the Indian Act in Canada and the reservation school system in Canada. He also instigated the reserve system in Canada. Now, for anyone who's unaware, the Indian reservation school system, what it essentially did was took 150,000 children away from their parents' arms and forcibly put them in institutions where they were systematically beaten, tortured, raped. They had their culture removed from them, their language, every aspect of them was destroyed. Those who tried to escape would often die in the cold or drown in the water. So it was a horrifying experience by all accounts. Now, the Catholic Church themselves have never formally apologized for this. Neither have they been held to account for the thousands upon thousands of priests and nuns who, again, tortured and raped children. So I believe if we're going to be talking about restorative justice, the first place to begin would be that they have to both be held accountable for the crimes that they've committed, as well as the fact that they have to, in some form or another, pay retribution to those in which they've harmed. Thanks.
Okay, with 18 seconds to spare. Now I'm going to throw it over to Tale of Two Rabbits for the last intro of the debate.
I would first like to thank Lance for asking me to join him today, and Dylan's Luscious Locks for moderating. I open, as I so often do, with a story. In 1601, Juan de Onate visited a gigantic agricultural and industrial center of more than 20,000 people in what is now central Kansas. Because he was a conquistador, he then kidnapped and tortured 4 children to identify the houses of the town's leaders, and immediately afterward he waged a war to destroy the city with an army of nearly 1,000 soldiers. It was a mass slaughter. For the next 500 years, the school-taught history of the United States was that tribes of the plains were barely organized, semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who knew only territorial wars and primitivism. And then, in 2016, using records, archaeological fieldwork, and remote sensing technology, Etzanoa once again became a fact. The stories natives had been telling for generations were finally again acknowledged as fact. As has happened many times in recent years, the U.S. was forced to again confront the cruelty and lies that had been perpetrated against the indigenous peoples right up to this very day. In May of 2021, using records, archaeological fieldwork, and remote sensing technology, the stories of the residential schools recorded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and told by natives for generations were finally again acknowledged as fact. Canada is presented with 2 possibilities when such simple and straightforward modifications to the histories that we were all taught as children are uncovered. We can, as in the case of Etzanoa, accept the correction, accept the native stories were true all along, and move forward with the knowledge that wrongs were committed that must be reckoned with. Or we can choose, as Lauren apparently has, what has brought us here today. Refuse the most basic and straightforward facts in favor of denial, deflection, and dismissal. I come here as witness to those facts, as one small voice in a chorus to those stories. I come here to discuss justice for those wrongs and the restoration of dignity for those who suffered
Time is
what
up.
was erased.
Okay. So I just want to re-establish the rules one last time. If it gets out of control, I will assert myself and shut down the conversation. If you believe it is unfair, I'm sorry to say that I don't care. I will do my best to restore. I'm a law and order moderator. Law and order. Other than that, I think everybody else knows no terms of service violations of any sort. We are now going to have an open format for about an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes at max. And then with 2-minute outros, anyone is free to start the conversation. It is now open for dialogue.
Well, considering that I've just been accused of denying basic facts, I would really like a tale of Twin Rabbit to describe which basic facts I've denied.
In your opening statement, you said that these deaths didn't occur and that these bodies weren't found.
That's not what I said, is it? I said there were no mass graves found.
I would be curious to know what your evidence is for that claim.
Firstly, I would like to ask both you and Lance to describe which mass graves have been found in Canada, and then I can respond to that.
Would you like to be more specific, as in the one that
Well,
was...
you're saying I'm lying by saying no mass graves have been found, so tell me, where have the mass graves been found?
Well, the story that kicked it off was the Kamloops residential school mass graves that were identified using ground-penetrating radar.
Right, and ground-penetrating radar cannot detect bodies.
Are you saying that as an assertion?
Absolutely, you can go look this up. In fact, the woman who conducted the GPR herself actually went to my university. She said herself, we cannot confirm anything. This is simply an assumption based on, and I would encourage people watching to go and take a look at what images ground-penetrating radar show. They just show anomalies in the ground. They don't give you any context. They don't tell you if bodies are there. The anomalies could appear to be graves. Do they know if this grave site is just an overgrown graveyard? Do they know if it was the community graveyard? Do they know if there are any bodies in what these ground anomalies look like? No. And this is the facts of the case. The woman who did the ground penetration test in Kamloops, which sparked this all off, stated, we cannot know if there are any bodies under here until someone has dug this up and they've exhumed the bodies, if they are there. And not only that, but the tribe leader there in Canada of the Kamloops band that brought out the initial statement about this said, even if there are bodies under the ground here, it's not a mass grave. And these are just preliminary findings, which has been the general consensus of all of these grave sites found, that they are not mass graves, and portraying it as such is deliberately misstating the truth and trying to make it seem as though Canada were committing some Holocaust where they were lining children up, shooting them, and throwing them in a grave that they dug, when we are talking about graveyards, if there are any bodies at all.
Okay, you just said that the woman who did the GPR examination went to college with you. The director of the company that actually did it is a man named Julio. So who did you go to school with?
No, she's an instructor at the university I went to, and I mean, I can read her name here. Let me. So this is the girl who did the GPR technology test, which once again, GPR cannot pick up organic matter. Her name was Sarah Bellew. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm terrible with French names. So she conducted the search herself, and she stated nothing she has found can be confirmed unless excavations are done at the scene. These excavations have not happened.
I didn't get to hear Tell Two Rabbits.
So this is from the Globe and Mail.
Hold on.
Give me a moment. I was trying to hear. Give me. Okay, let me just start. When I'm talking, nobody else is supposed to talk. I didn't hear what Tale of Two Rabbits was saying earlier. Could you repeat what you were trying to say?
Well, at this point, I'm a little bit lost. She's friends with someone whose name she doesn't know how to pronounce, who isn't the director of the company who was hired to do the scanning. So at this point, I don't understand exactly what it is we're discussing. I thought we were here to discuss burning of churches and restorative justice. If you'd like to challenge GPR and whether or not it's efficacious in the use of archaeological remains, I would point you to Etzanoa. Are you also challenging the identification of literally every site in the Americas that has?
Can I jump ahead?
Wait, I would let Tell Two Rabbits finish what they were trying to say. Can you? Finish that.
Because
at the
this
end.
is outside the scope of this conversation. I keep hearing affirmations of, oh, well, I know a person. I don't care that you know a person. I am
That's
talking
not my
about the company that did the work.
I'm
Okay.
talking about the woman who every Canadian article has stated did the search in Kamloops. And anyone can look this up. Go look up who did the GPR test in Kamloops. I'm reading the Globe and Mail right now. The title, Anthropologist Explains How She Concluded 200 Children Were Buried at Kamloops Residential School.
Okay, stop right
And-
there. Stop
Yep.
right there. How she concluded the 215 bodies were
Yep.
buried.
And
So
with it, once
she
again, that's
just
just
said-
media bullshit, because the article literally says she also stressed her findings cannot be confirmed unless excavations are done at the scene.
Can I
And
can
why
I
don't
jump
you
ahead
just
between the
tell me-
two of y'all?
Okay, 1 second. Lance was trying to say something before you, and so I wanted to make sure he got a chance to speak.
No,
Then
I
we'll
want
move to you.
I wanted Tail to finish what he's saying, and then I'll go after counterpoints.
Okay, then we'll have Tail finish what he's saying. Then we'll move over to counterpoints.
Okay.
If she would like to challenge the findings of basic archaeology, then she's welcome to do so, but that's not why we're here, as I was led to believe.
You made this accusation against me. I responded, and I'm citing the individual who made these findings.
Oh God, can I bridge these two fucking perspectives, please? Because otherwise we're gonna spend the whole time on fucking minutia.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and bridge these two perspectives for the love of God. The primary contention is not, GPR or whether or not kids died or anything like that. The whole reason is the use of definitions and words. Ultimately, I would like to avoid semantics, and instead of fighting over semantics, I would like to talk about the concepts that we're trying to convey. The main objection that I think Lauren is poking to, that I would poke to as well, is basically the use of mass graves. When we use words like mass graves, basically what I conceptualize is people handed shovels, marched out into the woods, executed, and then thrown in shallow graves, and then dirt loosely thrown over them. Okay, that's the primary contention here, is whether or not that's what's occurred. And based off of historical fact, which I'm sure Tale of Two Rabbits and TheSerfs can assert one way or the other, whether or not they agree with this, that's not what happened. They didn't march out 200 kids into the woods, execute them one at a time, throw them in a ditch, and throw dirt over them. And I have more points to this, but I just want to let's just bridge this gap on the definition of mass graves and keep it moving.
Caleb,
Sure.
if you haven't said anything yet, would you like to speak at all?
Yeah, totally. So, Lauren, you're already starting out with conspiracy theories. Whether or not you agree with the way the technology is being used, that's really not up for debate right now. Because at the end of the day, the people who have been accused right now of accomplishing these crimes, they, in no short form, have already, you've received a condolence from the Pope as an acknowledgement that something has happened here. There has been multiple instances, such as the Mohawk tribe, that have actually had to exhume bodies after ground penetration had been used. This is not something in which the ground penetrating radars have discovered these bodies and then suddenly we don't have any idea about whether or not this is occurring. Also, the testimonies that have been given in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which are numerous, we're talking thousands and thousands of people, have attested to the treatment of the children in these residential schools. Once again, that is not a matter up for, did they line them up against the walls and shoot every single one of them in the face? That is not exactly what happened here. Once they became wards of the state, as in once they became the property of the federal government or the provincial government, their treatment then became their responsibility. So whether they died from experimental starvation, which is something that happened, whether they died from high rates of tuberculosis, which is something that happened, whether they died from torture, rape, or abuse, which is something that happened, 1 in 5 children was sexually abused in these schools. That was sexual abuse that was happening while, again, they were children as wards of the state. So it doesn't matter how you want to try and skirt past whether or not these crimes had occurred.
Okay, I'd like to address that.
Sure.
So I'm
Do you want to give? It was towards Lauren, but are you okay with counter responding?
Yeah, he can respond. Actually, Connor, can I just quickly make one clarification and then I'll jump to you? I never stated atrocities didn't happen at these schools. It was a very unfortunate thing in the 1800s and early 1900s, particularly in general, that there were horrific things going on at orphanages, boarding schools, residential schools, of course, and there's proof of this. But you have asserted, and I don't want to see you walk back on this unless you're going to admit it, that these were mass graves. You have asserted that they are evidence of genocide when the very chiefs of these tribes, who you're saying are talking about the lived experience in the area, have stated these are not mass graves. Some of these, if the bodies are found, we don't know whose graves they even are. They could be a mix of settler children as well who died of tuberculosis. And there was a pandemic going on at this time that the residential schools were at their peak. These could be various reasons, but they were not mass graves. And that is what I am calling you out on. That's what I'm calling out all these activists on that have made this claim. And dying of tuberculosis, dying of disease, well, of course, we can talk about horrific, the horrific conditions. To say that people were intentionally trying to give children tuberculosis, I think is absurd. But I'll let Connor keep going.
Yeah, so I just want to jump ahead descriptively because at the end of the day, like this is what I guess frustrates me about this conversation. So we can describe wrongs and evils on a spectrum, and we can just acknowledge that they're evil and that they're wrong. So, for instance, Lauren and I are both parents. If our children were taken from us, forcibly taught another language, wards of the state, and then by the way, like the demographics or the stats that I saw was literally like 70% tuberculosis, like 20% fire, and 10% death from exposure during attempted escape. So if my son was kidnapped from my home, forced to learn another language, given a different name, and then tried to escape back to me and died in the woods, I can't think of a more horrific thing to experience, except for my family being dragged out all at once and being executed. So on a spectrum, it's pretty much like the second worst thing that I can imagine. And I think that we can concede that while also basically trying to get into the historical detail. And by the way, like this isn't so much so whenever I'm trying to describe past historical wrongs or anything like that, I'm not trying to excuse it. Okay, I'm trying to be descriptive about the historical past. And then what I would say, I'll just jump out on this limb, is that by definition, by the UN's own definition, kidnapping children and then basically trying to destroy in whole or in part a certain demographic group or whatever is the definition of genocide. The question is, when did this end? Whether or not this is comparable to other historical atrocities, which if on a spectrum, you can probably say, and then whether or not that justifies current vandalism and current attacks on Christian churches. That's kind of like the crux of it for me.
Okay, one moment. I was given a link by Lance that I've put in the chat about tuberculosis, and I will also put it in the group chat as well for everybody else. Lauren responded to Lance, so I want to give Lance some time to respond.
Yeah, so first off, there's studies that have come out now that say researchers say that tuberculosis at the residential schools was no accident. So again, that was one of the many things that were done to these children, including the fact that these children were experimented on by giving them various different degrees of sustenance, in that they were given malnutrition intentionally to see how children would react to different amounts of, say, milk and vitamins being given to them. The other thing to talk about when it comes to children and the residential schools and their atrocious numbers is, again, the mortality rate was about 40 to 60% in these Indian residential schools. If they are, like we've all established, I think we all agree right now, that they were wards of the state, it doesn't matter what the cause of death was, even though the cause of death in many cases could be things like, again, physical or sexual torture, including traditional torture. There was an electrical chair in one of these schools. That being done, it doesn't matter if they died from starvation, it doesn't matter what. If you are taking children from their parents, you become responsible as their guardian for what happens to them. So all the deaths are responsible under the residential school system. And finally, my last point is going to be this. We cannot talk about this as if it's something that happened a long time ago and just a sordid part of our past. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Okay, if you want some context, the last time Canada won the Stanley Cup was 1993. Fucking Nirvana was still playing, you know, like that's not generations ago.
Okay, I need to interject with one stat. There's one stat that I just need to clarify.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so Lance, you're saying that the mortality rate was 40 to 60%. You're talking about like individual schools, right? Not like the entirety of the program, right?
So according to the Dr. Bryce report, which was the medical inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs, he said the over sum total death was around 40 to 60% mortality rate for children in Indian reservation schools. Okay,
then I want to address this head on. Because basically the current historical estimate total for deaths is around 4,000. As we've already talked about previously in the debate, total participants are around 150,000. That puts the death rate at roughly 2.5%. So if you're talking about the roughly 40 to 60%, what I read was that there were some schools where there were fires. So as a result, like 70% or 60% of the student body died in that fire. I also read that there were tuberculosis outbreaks. So within that subset, of a specific school, like let's say there were 30 kids, 60% of them died in a horrific way. And I, again, like whenever I'm being descriptive, I'm not trying to minimize this. Okay. I'm not trying to minimize this, but I'm just trying to clarify that 150,000 students weren't taken into a boarding school and then 40 to 60% of them died. That's just not factually accurate.
I also have one thing I want to respond to Lance here, because this is really important.
Sure.
And
Would it be possible to allow Lance to respond to that first and then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
So from
All right.
yeah,
Yeah.
so from the same study counterpoints, it turns out that 90% of them suffered severe physical, emotional, or sexual abuse at the hands of the people who were guarding them. As a result of that, many of them also committed suicide. So it isn't simply a matter of them dying in fires, a matter of them dying by tuberculosis, a matter of them dying by starvation, which of course were all accountable reasons. If 90% of the children are suffering one of those conditions, I think you'd all agree that on some, like the sum total of this was an atrocity being committed.
Sure. And
Okay.
just because that was directed at me.
Yep.
Yeah, but Lauren
So
was
fast.
next.
If
So
you
fast.
if you've
Okay.
got a quick
Yeah,
point, yeah, go, and then I'll
Yeah.
go.
So fast. Again, whenever I'm being descriptive, I'm not trying to minimize what the fuck happened. It was fucking awful. I'm just trying to be descriptive so we are accurate. Because if I heard that 150,000 of my countrymen were, or ethnicity or whatever, were put through a system and 60% of them died, then maybe I would be Molotov cocktailing some shit, right? That's why we need to be very specific about what happened historically. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion.
Okay. Also, Lance, people asking for the source on what you've provided. Could you send that over to me?
Yeah,
As
of
I
course.
throw it over to Lauren.
Cool. Yeah. So this is something that really rubs me the wrong way whenever people talk about residential school programs and compare the residential schools that were opened in the 1800s to the ones that existed in the 90s and were closed down then. If we talk about, for example, Lance talked about an electric chair existing and then said the last residential school that existed was shut down in 97. That school was called Cavalic Hall, and it was
96.
closed in 96. It was closed in the Northwest Territories. It was not set up as a residential school. In fact, it was a whole legal battle with the Canadian government to even get it registered as a residential school, because what it actually was it was a hostel/boarding room that was set up for kids who did not have families that were near high schools because they were too rural. So the Northwest Territories government said, okay, we need to create boarding in the town, and then if kids are way far out in the middle of nowhere, we can give them the option to go to high school so they have somewhere to stay. An Indigenous kid came out, stayed in this boarding area, and then later took the government to court to get reparations for residential schools, claiming that it was a residential school because he was removed from his family home by the government for the purpose of education, and that he started speaking his language. He started forgetting some of his language while he was going to an English-speaking school, and thus that was part of the destruction of his history. And to compare this to schools where there was abuse going on, where there was tuberculosis outbreaks, and where people were being forcibly removed from their homes, and comparing that to schools where it's like, hey, you know, kids that are in rural areas can't have a high school education, let's create a hospital for them.
One moment.
Like,
Wait.
that's absurd. You can read the case.
Can you give me a moment? Can you give me a moment?
Watching this to read the case.
Lance, you can respond to that, of course.
Yeah, I guess my first response would be that if your assertion is that nothing bad happened at that school and then therefore it doesn't matter, my statement as to which the last residential school closed in 1996, I think you're just resorting to pedantry. That doesn't change the fact that it was still considered a residential school. And I would also like you to provide evidence that nothing bad ever happened in that institution. Regardless of that fact, it doesn't change the overarching problem that these residential schools are not a sorted part of our past. We're going to eventually have to evolve into the child and foster care system, because that was an evolution of the residential schools, and also talk about the fact that within the criminal justice system of Canada, almost 40% of all the Indigenous inmates are survivors of the residential school system. So the trauma that occurred in the residential schools did not simply end once the schools themselves closed. They would then continue as the individuals would work into society. And I guess that's where I would leave that one. If I know Tail hasn't talked very much, if he wants to inject something here.
Oh, okay. I mean,
Got a response to that.
Yeah.
Anybody's free to grab it if.
Okay, because
yeah, go ahead.
stating, prove to me that nothing bad ever happened in that school is one of the dumbest statements I have ever heard. Something bad happens in every school, whether it is the fanciest, nicest, wealthiest, whitest school on the planet. Bad things happen at every school. The argument there is that schools in the 1800s deliberately removing kids from their parents, taking them in, there being abuse, mass disease, horrible conditions, is different from a school that is set up, or a housing area that is set up voluntarily for kids to go and stay there so that they can be somewhere with a high school in the area. Like, you have to acknowledge that there is a difference between a lot of the schools in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that, when people talk about the residential school system still existing, were voluntary. They weren't being removed from their homes. They're called residential schools because they were still technically under colonial education, so they were not being taught their languages. They were not being taught their culture. And we can talk about how that could be a problem, but to compare that to the residential schools where children were being ripped away from their families is just not even on the same level, and I find that extremely disingenuous.
Sure. So if that's the dumbest thing you've ever heard in your life, you've lived a more privileged life than I thought possible. And I'm just going to say this, the burden of proof would then be upon you. If you're going to assert that this school doesn't really constitute a residential school, because at the end of the day, nothing bad happened here related to the same systems in place from the other residential schools in Canada, then again, please demonstrate that with some kind of factual evidence.
I mean, okay, so the Canadian government argued that it wasn't a residential school, but, and I'm telling you, sure, it is registered as a residential school, but the reason is this individual who wanted to get compensation was able to make the argument, I was removed from my family to go to an education system which did not uphold my language. And the removal from the family was voluntary. His claim that it was his only option, and he claims that he was told he should go there, even though he only has a signed affidavit and no proof of that. People can go read the case themselves. So like, I'm just saying, if you want to say that's what residential schools were and say that's the same as all the past ones, then I'm actually not feeling that bad for the past ones. But of course they're not the same. Of course. Like,
yeah, and what I'm saying is that you're being caught in the pedantry of trying to assert that this one residential school doesn't count. When at the end of the day, my statement, and it remains the same, was that the last residential school closed in 1996. That is just a factual statement.
But they were not, okay, well, can we...
Okay, and now you would like to establish on top of that...
In the 1800s?
Yes,
and
if you want to...
The same?
And can you establish then that nothing bad happened in that school? And if you can, fine. But at the end of the day, again, this is pedantry. It's just like, okay, this is probably one of the weakest gotchas I've seen so far.
Then we'll go back.
It's not.
Okay, Lauren, you can clarify.
Okay. So for another example of this and why it matters is some of the places called residential schools that retained the name residential schools well into the 80s and 90s were even run by native bands themselves. They were handed over. So if you're going to talk about how these residential schools were committing atrocities well into the 80s and 90s, then we're going to have to start punishing and asking for apologies from native bands themselves, like the Cowessess band, who held on to their residential school and ran it for 16 years. So yes, it does matter what happened and what these schools turned into later on.
Either of you are free to respond.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know if Tail's still here.
At this point, I'm just baffled. So,
okay,
so far,
I'll let you speak.
We've denied the Indian Act. We've denied the removal policy. We've denied that because one guy said a bad thing incorrectly once, therefore all atrocities never happened. We've denied.
No one is saying no atrocities happened.
That's what we said.
Wait.
That's what we said.
Let's let him finish.
We've denied mass graves exist, even though the definition of mass is big. So at this point, I'm just lost. What definitions are we even working with? I'd really like some clarification on some of this. I mean,
so is a graveyard a mass grave?
If we're going to throw out the Indian Act as even a discussable topic, then feel free. I have no trouble with that, because as I was led to believe, the initial conversation was on restorative justice. If we're going to backtrack on that topic, okay.
Okay, we're not backtracking on shit. If you want to talk about that topic, then start talking about that topic. But like, seriously, all right. So I literally took 10 seconds to Google the word mass grave. It says a pit dug in the ground to receive a large amount of corpses. If a lot of bodies are buried individually because they're dead, then is a cemetery a mass grave?
Do you have evidence that they were all individually dug? According to Lauren,
I'm-
only
They
Okay,
calculated that there
hold
were
on.
individual bodies with the
Lauren,
GPR.
Lauren, I
According
got it.
to
I'm not
Lauren-
trying. Okay, let me not be a dick. Okay, I'm not going to be a dick. I'm just going to try to break it down. So
are you both incapable of letting me finish a sentence?
I am
According
perfectly
to Lauren, only a few moments ago, we're talking about pits, right? According to Lauren, GPR is incapable of identifying bodies. So how would it know whether or not they were all buried at the same time?
Okay, so I'll address this because I'm not Lauren, if you want me to.
Feel free.
Okay, what I would say is that based off of all of the reading that I've made, there's plenty. And for the audience at fucking home again, I'm just trying to be descriptive. I'm not trying to justify. Okay, I'm trying to be descriptive so we can all get on the same page descriptively. All right, on the same page. Let's keep going. As far as I can tell, from what I've seen from the historical record of the Canadian residential school system, what happened was, let's just call it cultural genocide. They took kids forcibly from people's homes, brought them to a boarding school, forced them to all live together with very limited supervision because of poor conditions, malnutrition, and basically lack of supervision. Kids were abused. Kids had improper medical care. They had improper nutrition, and a bunch of them died from I don't want to say tuberculosis is an easily preventable disease, but from disease, okay? A significant chunk of them died from disease from the conditions that they were forced into, okay? We're conceding that point. Now, also, on top of that, a lot of them died in fires because these buildings were built like shit, okay? So a decent chunk of them died from fires. And then even on top of that, a lot of kids tried to escape because the conditions were so poor and they died from exposure. That is the historical record as far as I understand it. Now, if we're going to bring this down to the American level, I can tell you that the United States of America, especially before the 19th century, does have mass graves. Guaranteed. Because what we did instead is we just fucking killed Native Americans, okay? So again, this is a spectrum of awful. I'm not trying to say it's good or bad. I'm just trying to be descriptive. So when we're talking about these graves, we're probably talking about kids who died either from tuberculosis, fire, or exposure, and they were probably buried after they were dead. Mass grave to me, because maybe I'm just a lay person, but mass grave to me implies that we are marching people out into an area, we're fucking killing them, and we're throwing them in a pit. That is my understanding of it. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my understanding.
As opposed to digging a hole for all of the bodies of the kids who died in the fire that all happened at once?
Yeah, do you think that the priest set the fire, or do you think it was accidental? Because that's kind of important.
Do you think that there's no such thing as a mass grave at these residential schools using the conditions that you yourself just set on the restriction of the definition of that term?
Fine, Tail, you fucking win, okay? Maybe 7 kids were all buried at the same time and it's a mass grave. Can we get to the fucking descriptive part of it? Like, can we get back to like reality?
I would love to.
Can I
never
please
left it.
jump in here? Okay, I have a question for you. So we're talking about the mass graves that the media have alleged happened, that Lance has been tweeting about, that progressives have been tweeting about, and you're saying that they are mass graves where people just dug pits. Because I just want to let everyone know, GPR technology can only find anomalies in the soil. It can't find bodies. So the way that they are trying to find, or how they claim they are trying to find these individual bodies or find these numbers, how they're getting the 250 number, how they're getting that 750 number, is they're saying they're finding burial spots and graves. And that's why some have also been mistaken for they've said they were, Native children buried, but it ended up just being a graveyard. So if we're talking about GPR technology that is finding individual graves, and these are what is being called mass graves, they literally cannot be mass graves because it's only detecting individual burial spots. So no, this whole idea that you're saying that, yes, it was pits and bodies were thrown in, no. Based on the technology that was used and the way they are counting and getting these numbers, it's impossible.
Nope, I've already conceded it. You can't take it back. Forever. That's the record now.
Okay, I see. All right, mass graves, whatever.
Okay,
the reason we need to establish what crimes happened to talk about retributive justice is we need to know what the retributive justice we're discussing was for, right?
Sure,
That's why we're discussing
absolutely.
this.
Okay, so I'd like to answer that one for you. This is a question to both Counterpoints and Lauren. As of now, how many priests and nuns have been convicted for sexual crimes against children as a result of the residential school system?
Dude, I'm on the same page. If priests and nuns committed sexual assault against kids, put them in jail. But like, you know, build a mass, never mind. But like this shit happened in the US. This shit happened at boys' schools in Florida. This shit happened in Ireland. It was horrific. And I hope every one of those things is investigated. We don't disagree on that. And if it didn't happen, it should happen. What we're disagreeing on is whether churches should be burned down today and whether there were mass graves.
So, Counterpoints, do you want to attempt answering the question, because Lauren seems unable to?
How many? I don't know. How many?
No. I don't want to answer how many. I was going to back her up on a moral point. So no, please tell me.
Sure. No, I'm sure we're all against pedophilia. So as of now, there's been 40 convictions, and that means that there's been 37,951 complaints that have been levied. They have not been pursued. As of now, an estimated 5,000 priests, nuns, and teachers have committed sex crimes against these children, and they're not being charged for that. The first time anyone was put to task for this was in 2008, and that was somebody who had molested 17 boys, and that was the first major conviction. So this is what I mean when I say that there hasn't actually been retributive justice in this case, right? If we're dealing with thousands and thousands of priests, nuns, and teachers who had sexually molested children, that would be a place to start. I mean, unlike the Catholic churches, who at this point we do not know who's burning them down, in this case we do know who committed these heinous crimes.
Okay, then to address this head on, this is where, like, again, I am not your enemy in this fight at all. So if anybody touched any kid of any background and abused them, then what I think the system should do to them is not even fit for Twitch. Okay? And I don't care who that person is, what institution they're a part of, whether or not they're a member of my race, whether or not it was an institution supported by the government. Go after them with the full force of the law and punish them accordingly.
Would you both state that at this point the Catholic Church should stop withholding the names of those who may be guilty?
If you're talking about putting them public and you're saying may be guilty, no, I don't think people on trial for sex crimes that haven't been confirmed guilty should be put public, because usually what happens is if they're found innocent or falsely accused, their lives get destroyed for something they didn't do. So until there is a crime and a conviction that happens, of course, keep the names private. But I think those convictions should be, they should try to get those convictions, if the person is guilty, to the utmost of their ability. Now, we have to recognize, and this is a horrible thing, but it's very, very difficult to prove these crimes retrospectively that happened a long, long time ago. And if we're going to have a justice system at all, if we are going to have a system that says innocent until proven guilty, that has to be the standard. We can't just throw people in jail because we think, or just based on an accusation without proof. And, that sucks. It sucks that reality is like that. But you know what also sucks? People who did nothing going to jail for the rest of their lives for a sex crime they didn't commit. That's just, yeah.
I'm curious why we keep setting this as a long, long time ago. I was still figuring out Windows 95 when the last of the boarding schools in Canada was closed. There were even still a few that are open today in the United States. These are ongoing crimes.
We address that, keep up.
Then address it again.
Okay, not to mention, even a rape committed against anyone in the 90s would be very difficult to prove and get evidence for today. I'm not even sure when we started getting these systems in place for rape kits in Canada. Like, when did that even come about? I'd have to research that. But this is, it's very difficult to prove these historical cases.
I just want to address this point head on because I don't want to feel like we're dodging. Okay, so what we said was that during the early 20th century and during the late 19th century, there were brutal fucking conditions. And as these things became less and less acceptable, some of these schools were turned over to native control. Some of these schools that ended in 1996, as Lance pointed out, that Lauren supposedly has a study for, that I don't have a study for, was literally just a fucking boarding school for Native American kids. Now, I can't prove to you that no sex abuse happened, because whenever there's fucking teenagers anywhere, fucking sex abuse happens. Sex abuse happened happened at my white suburban bullshit fucking school. Kids were doing cocaine in the fucking bathroom and having fucking sex. I can't tell you that nothing bad happens anywhere, okay? But what I can say is that if you wanted to pick a school that you wanted to live in as a fucking time traveler, then you wouldn't want to go to the one in the 1920s, because there was probably a significant chance that you would get your ass kicked and nobody would give a shit. You would die of tuberculosis, or you would die in a fucking fire. Whereas if you went to the boarding school in 1992 and it was Native American run and it was fucking, then basically there's a strong chance that it was just a normal boarding school with all of the boarding school problems that we have today. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so the key difference here, I just have one quick point.
Wait, no. When I'm talking, nobody talks. So far, I just got the time. So far, Lauren has talked more than both Lance and Tail combined. So I want to make sure that I give Lance and Tail some time to speak uninterrupted for a little bit. Lance?
Sure. I just wanted to address counterpoints. The difference there between what you stated and what happened is that they didn't choose to go to these schools. They were taken and forced to go to these schools. So even if you do say that there are institutions in which there are multiple people committing sex crimes and whatever that is, this is still a situation in which the children were forcibly removed from their parents and forced to be in these schools. So again, as wards of the state, everything that occurs to them is the responsibility of either the Catholic Church or the government of Canada.
Okay, let's get to the meat of this real quick, because no one's denying bad things happened. No one's denying bad things are bad. The only disagreement here is you guys seem to think there were mass graves. There's no evidence for them. Do you still think there were mass graves after this discussion? How many bodies have been exhumed at these graves that have recently been discovered?
So that seems to be the only thing that you're trying to propose as your conditions. But if you didn't listen to what Dylan just said, he said that you'd spoken the most in this debate, and so he was going to give Tail of Twin Rabbits a chance to speak.
Okay, he's happy to. I was just trying to get back on topic and then to the church burnings.
Your topic, but yeah.
Well,
Tail, that's the topic we agreed on.
Okay. Tail, if you want to speak, you're free to speak.
At this point, I'm a little bit lost. There's been a lot of philosophical quibbling over the definition of the word mass grave, to the point where someone had to Google it because they didn't even know the definition coming into the game, which I think is a little inappropriate. If you're going to be discussing a topic, you should at least be mildly prepared. And when we're talking about things like ground penetrating radar, I again go back. If we're going to challenge the findings of those who have done the research, then you're challenging the foundation of archaeology in the Americas. If you would like to do that and lay out your argument for a better technique for identifying locations that should be excavated, I welcome you to do so. You haven't proposed anything remotely resembling that. What you did instead was to say that you went to school with a person whose name you can't pronounce, who is somehow vaguely related to a company who's oddly not listed anywhere on the company's prospectus. That's not terms, that's not definitions, and that's certainly not facts. That's just random anecdotes.
I have just posted the
Lauren,
article in the chat.
Lord, please, for the love of God. Tale of Twin Rabbits, I'm pretty sure your brain is running on 1995, okay? We're fucking 30 minutes into this goddamn debate talking about, like, I don't know, terms about fucking murder and descriptive reality and history and all that kind of shit. And you want to talk to Lauren about fucking GPR and whether or not she can offhand fucking come up with a new way to conduct anthropology? I don't give a shit. Fucking catch up. Because basically what you're doing right now is you're acting smarter than everybody else in the fucking room while saying absolutely fucking nothing. If you want to take your fucking galaxy brain fucking 10 head and your individual experience, then please educate us. But if I have to hear fucking Lauren's a dumbass about GPR one more fucking time for 35 fucking seconds, I'm gonna fucking lose it. So either educate us, talk about the subject, keep up with the fucking conversation, or just don't bring up GPR again, because I don't give a fuck and I don't trust Lauren to reinvent anthropology in the next fucking 10 minutes. Okay, well,
so
let's
by
move.
the way, I just really need to make the point that I am not making this up. I am citing.
No, Lauren.
Okay, sorry.
Please, in the future, do not do that. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Rabbits, I want you to respond to Connor. He said a lot. Or if you want to respond, it's completely up to you.
I mean, if he needs to take a little break and get a glass of water, that's fine. I have no objection.
Okay. I want to throw it over to Lance since, again, the time is extremely lopsided at the moment. I want to make sure both sides get ample speaking time. Lance, do you want to say anything?
Well, just to counterpoint's statement there, if Lauren is making the assertion that she believes, in this case, that this technology is not representational of the fact that there are mass graves, or perhaps we're lost again in the semantics of what constitutes a mass grave, then that is not on Tail to have to educate anyone on. He's simply stating that she is putting into question the findings, which have already been agreed upon, by the way, by most of Canadians. This is not something that's being disproven. This is, again, being stuck in semantics. And I can see Lauren's losing her mind in the process of hearing this. There's a reason why multiple people, including everyone here's favorite, Justin Trudeau, has come forward and stated that, yes, we'd like to apologize for this. We have acknowledged that this was genocide, that it is an ongoing process. He's become the first sitting prime minister to say that. I'm no fan of Justin Trudeau, but I think it's reached a point now where this is not something that is being, let's just say, debated. But I'll leave it to Tail to finish that.
Well, and I understood that the topic was supposed to be retributive justice, and we still haven't talked about that.
So talk about it, bro beans.
Can I respond? Just a 2-second response here.
Sure,
No.
you can respond.
Hold on.
Not.
Just
Okay, I
hold
thought
on.
you were done. Okay, you can continue.
Well, I got interrupted there by counterpoints for just a moment. I was willing to let him finish, I suppose. But in any case, I'm not particularly interested in educating you. If you would like to talk to me after, then that's fine. I'd be happy to provide you plenty of information on the subject of ground penetrating radar. I know it frustrates you when I say that term. I'm not concerned with that. And that wasn't what the thesis of my statement actually was. I said we're quibbling over definitions because I haven't been confronted with any facts. So that's my concern. If you would like to somehow contradict what I said there, you may feel free to do so. But as I understood it, the topic here was about retributive justice. So I would like to know what the two of you mean when you talk about that so that we can discuss it.
Okay,
I'm
Connor,
not interested in discussing
dare
it.
mansplain.
Okay, I'm going to mansplain.
Don't you
wait.
dare. Give me 1 minute because I just really need to respond to this one point. We have to determine if there was a genocide or not because that was part of this topic. So that's why we are discussing this. And I really need to respond to the fact that Lance and Tale of Twin Rabbits have just spent their whole last chat talking about how I have not provided any proof, and I'm trying to reestablish the whole field of archaeology and anthropology, and that I've made this up. That is not true. I've linked the Globe and Mail article in our Discord chat, and this is what the researcher who found the initial graves that sparked this all off said. My findings cannot be confirmed unless excavations are done, which is why we need to pull back a little bit, and they are probable burials. They are targets of interest for sure, said Dr. Bellio, who has about a decade of experience in the field, including working with the RCMP. She said the sites have multiple signatures that present like burials, but we do need to say that they are probable until one excavates, because we actually don't know the story behind them. We don't know if there's even bodies in there. We don't know if this is an overgrown graveyard, and these are the facts. I'm citing the researcher. This is not something I am making up, and you guys need to stop asserting that.
Sure.
So-
Can I respond to that? Or?
Yes, I just want to make it very clear. I see kind of raising your hand. I really want to give some, and I'm going to. This is the last time I'm going to do it, so please take advantage of the opportunity that you guys have. Like the difference in speaking time is very great right now, so I want to make sure that both sides are probably represented. Lance, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so when it comes to the finding of the children, what you're doing, Lauren, is you're not presenting any facts. What you're doing is that you're trying to selectively use parts of an article, the Globe and Mail article, I have it before me right now, in order to assert a conspiratorial claim. Now, if we look at, let's say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all right, which is the largest study that has ever been done in this field. It is one that was started in 2008. It cost over $100 million to do, and it was one that interviewed thousands upon thousands, again, of Indigenous survivors who had experienced the horrors and atrocities of the residential schools. The consensus and the broad consensus by this commission was overwhelmingly that not only did this constitute genocide, but that there was multiple children who had died at these schools and, yes, were buried near the schools themselves. This was part of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So what you're trying to do, and what you often do, and what I'm sure Rebel News has taught you very well to do, is to try and take selective parts of an article like you have here in the Globe and Mail, and then utilize that to try and extrapolate a theory. And that's just not going to cut it in terms of what we're talking about now. I think eventually we should move on to the idea of Catholic churches, because that's something you wanted to talk about. But one of the final points that I wanted to move on to, if you want to talk about Canadian genocide and talk about the process, is move on to the child care and the foster care system. But I see Counterpoints has his hand up, so I'll let him talk.
Yeah.
Okay, wait.
Please.
One second. I just want to give one last opportunity to tell Connor. Law and order,
No.
okay? I just want to give one last opportunity to tell two rabbits to speak at this point so we can rebalance the time slots. Rabbit?
I'm fine. Counterpoint seems very interested to go.
Okay, Connor.
Thank you. So you said no facts were given. But basically what I would say is Lauren and I have come at you with a bunch of descriptive facts. And not only that, they fit a shitload of your narrative. We've already said that there's probably a few thousand students that died in the residential school system. As a matter of fact, the current official estimate from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission puts it about 4,300, okay? Based off of the narratives collaborated, or whatever the fuck the word is, at the Truth and Reconciliation, it was largely poor conditions, disease, abuse, exposure, and fire. Those are the majority of the things. The primary contention that I've had historically in this entire conversation is whether or not we should use the term mass graves, which I get is a little bit pedantic for Tale of Two Rabbits or whatever. But at the same time, when somebody says mass graves to me, I'm assuming marching a bunch of children out into the fucking woods and executing them and then shoving them into a ditch and then throwing fucking dirt on them. And as I've already conceded, if that was reality, then I would be doing some fucked up shit right about now. Okay? And it's not that any of this is not awful, but there's a spectrum of fucking awful. So whenever I'm trying to be accurate descriptively and I'm presenting these facts to you, these facts that are like agreed upon by the people who support your narrative, the reason why I'm doing that is because I don't want people to go out there and say there are mass graves in Canada. There's 4,000 kids that were discovered, and basically the Canadian government has been committing genocide. Oh shit, that sounds fucking awful. That sounds like the fucking Canadian Mounted Police walked a bunch of kids out into the woods and shot them in the back of the head and threw them in shallow ditches. That's what people think when you say that shit. So when I'm being descriptive and I'm being pedantic and I'm trying to boil out these fucking definitions, it's because when people say that shit, they have emotional and mental and logical justification to go throw Molotov cocktails at shit. But when you say instead that there were horrific conditions, the Canadian government committed cultural genocide, it was not addressed up until like 1996. On top of that, there's systemic issues that extend into the modern day that are unaddressed, that Canadians only seem willing to reconcile with right now. That's a massively different narrative. Now, maybe the anger still needs to be there. Maybe the passion still needs to be there. Maybe the Reformation still needs to be there. But at the same time, it's not the same as mass execution of children. So that's where I'm being pedantic and annoying.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to address that directly. So you've already acknowledged that under the conditions of the residential school system, every single death that occurs is because they are, again, wards of the state, right? So it doesn't matter if they're dying from tuberculosis, doesn't matter if they're dying from malnutrition, starvation, they're still deaths that are responsibility of the provincial or federal government, correct?
Okay, what I would say is, while not necessarily biting that bullet in full, I do think that it is their responsibility and it is their wrong. So I'm not trying to split hairs here. I'm trying to be very specific. Some of these things are not controllable, okay? Fires, tuberculosis, all that kind of stuff. Some of that stuff isn't controllable. But at the same time, there's something called liability, which means responsibility. The government was in charge of these people. The Native Americans whose children were forcibly taken by the government lost something that is very important to them. There's nothing more important to me in this world than my son, okay? So since the Canadian government took children and either accidentally or negligently killed them, they owe the families whose children were killed something. Where that's restorative justice, systemic change, all that kind of bullshit. We can talk about that in the next segment.
Yeah, sure. So it seems to me like it's just a point of disgust that you want to reach, right? So for you, it would be egregious and beyond the pale if the children were taken out into the back of the woods and they were shot in the face. That to you is like, okay, that justifies me burning down a church, apparently. Whereas I would say that in this condition, the things that happened, when the statistics show 1 in 5 of the children was sexually molested, that to me is horrifying enough in and of itself to not even have to bring up the other things. Again, those things include experimentation. Those things include torture. Those things include physical and sexual abuse. all of which to me are beyond the pale. So it doesn't matter to me whether or not we're going to quantify this in this kind of strange scale of eyeballs, right? Which is more horrifying? And are they shot in the face, or are they all just sexually molested by priests? Either way, again, as wards of the state, the Canadian government, the Catholic Church were responsible for overseeing their safety. They failed horrifyingly at that.
Okay, but descriptively, I know, Lauren, you want to go, but I'm very excited. So basically, descriptively, this actually very closely parallels onto the BLM riots of the previous year, okay? I can understand descriptively why riots are occurring. Systemic injustice, over-policing, the drug war, like all that kind of stuff. I can understand descriptively why these things are happening while not thinking that they're necessarily morally justifiable. So that's the same parallel that I would exactly draw to this thing, where I can understand that if your uncle or something like that was a part of the residential school system, he was sexually abused, and then a story comes out saying that there's mass graves in Catholic churches, and there's a Catholic church up the block, and you're either a leftist who's sympathizing with Native Americans, or you're a Native American person yourself, why you would commit vandalism. I understand that descriptively. But I also think that it's based on some shittily communicated information, and that doesn't make it morally just, which I'm very happy to explore in the next segment, because basically once we get into the details of the next segment, I think you're going to kind of see why the reaction to this stuff is also fucked up.
Yeah, but see, I'm not here arguing in favor of people destroying churches. I'm not here arguing, even if they were the victims, like I can understand why it's justifiable, but I'm not saying that that is a fair course of action to be taking. I'm not here to justify people destroying churches. I mean, if that's where we're going to move, that's fine. I would start by saying at this time, we do not know who is burning the churches down.
I think it's also really telling.
I wanted to throw it over to Lauren, because Lauren's been waiting a little bit. Then I'll throw it over to Tail afterwards.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question for you, Lance, is whether you think these church burnings are justified, because I made a video on the church burnings, and you obviously responded with a long response where you claimed that my video condemning the church burnings was further victimizing the Indigenous community because I was blaming them for it, something I never asserted once in my entire video. So, it may have been easy to debate a straw man version of me, but now I'm actually here. I actually think it's a lot of progressives doing it. And we can't say we don't know who are doing these burnings when people are literally signing off with activist messages or spray painting and graffitiing activist messages. These are clearly progressive activists that have been inspired by the highly exaggerated talk of mass graves, which some of which, like ones found in Kelowna, in BC anyways, were just graveyards that were overgrown but called mass graves. So we know these are activists. We know they are being invigorated by false and exaggerated news. Do you condemn that? And do you condemn the church burnings and attacks in general?
Yeah,
okay, so that was a direct question to Lance, so I'm going to let Lance respond, but then I want to go to Tail.
Okay, so first off, that was absolutely fascinating because you contradicted yourself mid-sentence, so that was something to behold. You just stated at the very beginning that, like, I'm not going to assert who's causing this, there's just no way of knowing. I wouldn't do that. Well, at the same time, mid-sentence, you're like, but we do know who is doing this because there are signs and activists committing these crimes and atrocities. Even if you have signs and even if you have revelations, excuse me, I'm speaking, we're going to finish this. Even if you do have signs, even if you do say that, yes, at the end of the day, this must be Antifa or this must be an Indigenous community who's doing it, we would still need to have direct evidence of that. We would still need to have individuals who are arrested. We would still need to have testimonies. We would still need to have a single criminal conviction in this regard. And when it comes to these these Catholic churches burning down, yes, I do condemn them. I'm not here to defend people burning down religious institutions. That's not what I'm here to defend.
Okay, I'm going to throw it over to Tail, and that was directed at Lauren, so we'll bring it back to Lauren.
Well, I do also find it interesting that we keep trying to move this definition of what was an acceptable level of death, like whether or not the fires at these residential schools can be attributable to some sort of nefarious intent. And my answer to that would be, well, maybe if they hadn't had the removal policy in the first place, then those kids wouldn't have died in those fires. But it is a curiosity to me that we do keep talking about these church fires. The church fires have been happening since long before the information came out about these kids. I mean, for example, on November 1st of 2020, there were two Southwestern Ontario churches that were roughly 10 minutes apart. They were both set on fire. There was a series of arsons that were attributable to a man who was apparently arrested over COVID violations just the week before the news was released. That was, by the way, attributed by Rebel News to cultural Marxists who were trying to rebel against mask regulations. So what is it we're talking about right now? I'm not in favor of church burnings. I think it's bad because it tends to destroy the records of these kids who were murdered and tortured. I think it's a bad idea overall, but I'm not seeing any evidence whatsoever that it somehow sprang fully formed from the forehead of Antifa 5 minutes after they found out that something was amiss at the residential schools. People have known what was going on at the residential schools for years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out in 2016. So we've had plenty of time to process this information. Why are we suddenly worried about all of these church burnings? They've been happening for quite a while now.
By the way, this wasn't a secret to Indigenous communities. Like, this was one of the things where it was a revelation to Canadians.
Lance, I said that Lauren would be next. I'll get it back over to you, but I want to be fair. Lauren?
Yeah. Even the mainstream media, even if you go look at the most leftist sources, they're not denying that there is a link between these church burnings and the recent reports. Why? Because the media headlines, even the prime minister, are talking about these mass graves, which the media are asserting and exaggerating are mass graves, and that's why this whole previous conversation was important. Of course it's linked. When you have 12 churches being attacked one night after a mass media storm about mass Indigenous graves, and the churches have writing on them that say save Indigenous children, the idea that you could assert this has no link and that it's just random church burnings, I think is very, very silly. And Connor, I see you're putting your hand up there.
I see. On Hippy Dippy, we usually have a hand raising rule, so I think I've kind of like done it like
yeah, we've all been doing
dogs, you know.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry,
so
I know I'm not the mod.
So it's like what's a Pavlov? You know how Pavlov like made the dogs like twitch if he did a certain thing. It's kind of like that. So that's why he's raising his hand. We're gonna go to Lance first and then Connor, since Lance was trying to speak earlier. Lance.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly say that there has been numerous Indigenous chiefs as well as band members who have come out and emphatically condemned the church burnings. They've also stated that these churches were integral parts of their community. So I think to lay blame on any one person, especially again before we understand who's done it, historically it has all been proven to be a very dangerous practice. So in the event that an individual in this case is arrested, in the event that we have a testimony, in the event that we find out that it happens to be the dreaded communists or Antifa, in which case, yes, I will acquiesce and gladly say, well, now we have a reason to state that this is the reason why this has occurred. Again, I'd like to say emphatically that this was not news to Indigenous communities. This was not a new revelation. They have known for generations. The majority of the families of the children who had died in residential schools were told by those schools that their children ran away. That was like, if you listen to the testimony of the people who have experienced this, in the vast majority of those cases, those kids, if they did run away, which sometimes they were just killed in school themselves, they would have died on the journey. Many of them drowned, many of them froze. So it's not a case of all of a sudden this has opened up a secret. What this did do was this did reveal everything to Canadians. Polls came out afterwards that 2/3 of Canadians had no idea about residential schools before any of this occurred. And yes, I think that is a good thing that they've learned about this entire horrifying part of our history. But that doesn't mean at that same time you can simply state that the blame of this was going to be laid on any one person.
Okay,
Connor.
Thank you. And part of the reason why I keep raising my hands is because you keep ringing the dinner bell and you keep taking away my fucking dog bowl. All right. So, goddamn. So, okay. I hate asking questions in debates because I'm not trying to fucking gotcha you. But if we were just trying to logically think about it, as far as factional groups within within Canada, okay, we have the conservative Canadians. They're probably not doing it. I think that's safe to say, especially if they're Christian. We have, maybe we have Satanists. Maybe all the Satanists have gotten on like a Reddit forum and they're just like, fuck churches, all specifically right now. Fuck churches, right? Maybe that happened. Who fucking knows, right? Somebody go check 4chan. But the fucking lines that I'm drawing here seem very straightforward, that upsetting news about the residential school system has been released and been the focus of media attention for at least the past couple of years. That's why we're talking about it right now, because it's relevant. Regardless of whether or not it's pissed off Indigenous folk or people who sympathize with them, is kind of a moot point. But I think here to be like, you have to find evidence that this is the prime motivator. Why? Who else would be doing it besides people who saw the news, got pissed off, and decided they wanted to do something about it? I'm not talking about whether or not it's good or bad. I'm just saying, why are we trying to play hide the ball here about who's doing what and why?
Because I'm not stating that we have to ignore what the prime motivator would be. I'm sure you can make that assertion. I'm saying that we cannot claim or lay blame on any one group until we found out who exactly is doing it. You can state, here's why I think this is the reason why it is, but I think it's been very dangerous if people are going to attribute to this. Say, like, I've heard online that a lot of people consider this to be indigenous activists, right? That they were burning these churches out of anger and malice. I've heard a lot of people suggest that it may be, as you both have, far leftist groups who are doing the exact same thing. You can attribute who you think the blame may lay at, but until we know who has done it, I don't think we can definitively say or claim in this debate, here's who is the responsible party and here's why you have contributed, or the leftists have contributed, or the media has contributed towards an atmosphere that resulted in these churches being burnt down.
Sure. And actually, I want to address this head on because this kind of gets into justice, right? So for me, the same way that you're asking that, like, hey, left-wing groups, it could be some individuals in the left-wing groups that are doing this, but left-wing groups in general probably aren't doing this as a policy. And as a matter of fact, there's people in left-wing groups and indigenous circles that are actually discouraging these behaviors, and they're not trying to encourage them. They're actually saying, this is fucked up, please stop. It's counterproductive.
The vast majority,
like
the vast majority of bands and chiefs who've come out have spoken against it.
Awesome. So when we move this conversation into justice, basically what I would assert is that this is where I would want to see justice meted out. So on a, I don't want to say an individual level, but almost on an individual level. So for instance, you were talking about priests that did the molestation. They should be investigated, prosecuted, and convicted, right? Whether maybe the church should consider paying restitution to people who are proven to be victims or some shit like that, okay? Maybe the government should try to address systemic issues in order to help people out, okay? Especially people who are specifically affected by these issues. I think that's all well and good. What we're trying to avoid here, actually very specifically through this conversation, or at least what my goal would be, is avoiding a cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious civil war in our liberal democracy. And the thing is, Canada's reckoning with this right now. America's not even fucking close to reckoning with any of this shit. Whether we're talking about Native American affairs, slavery, like any of that kind of shit, we're not even close to starting to describe to each other the actual historical wrongs that we have done to each other. So I want to get into this in a second, but I understand that you guys have asserted repeatedly that there's an ongoing genocide. I would probably contend with that definition, but you can say that there's systemic issues or whatever, but I would see the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we have stats on all the initiatives that they have started already. I would actually see that as the fucking gold standard of transparency. It's actually incredible what they've done. Now, is it completely accurate? Maybe not. Is everything productive? Probably not. But as far as actually going to the root of the problem, coming up with descriptors, coming up with policy, and then trying to implement it, it's fucking amazing. So I'm happy to get into that in a second.
Yeah, I'm actually just genuinely surprised with that response, because we've just been throwing all these spicy shots, but I agree with most of what you said, and I think it's actually a very constructive way of dealing with this problem. At the end of the day, what has upset me most, especially with Lauren's video, is that I think this idea of suddenly talking about the moral outrage at the church burnings, which I agree, burning of religious institutions is something to be astounded at, is trying to change the narrative from something that is an ongoing crisis in this country, which is the treatment of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people. And that is the thing that we should be talking about. That is the thing we should be concentrating on. And that is the thing we should be addressing. So I think that, yes, it is horrifying that churches are burning down, but I don't want anyone to lose the concentration that things like discovering of, dead children, buried children, Indigenous and residential schools, if this is where suddenly the public conscience has come, and this is what we're talking about, then let's utilize this as an opportunity to start talking about the issues of cultural genocide that are occurring to Indigenous people today.
Okay, I'm gonna respond since you
Yeah,
talked about my
respond.
video. Lance, I watched your video and you actually liked the beginning of my video because I did not ignore the problems that happened in residential schools. I discussed them. You liked that aspect. Where you didn't like it was when I started talking about the church burnings. And these are not these problems cannot just exist. You can talk about both problems. Why not? And we need to, because we actually have an injustice happening today that we can talk about and deal with and stop. And then the other ones, I mean, you say there's injustice happening today and the government are working on that. There are a lot of policies they've put in place for healing, and maybe there are more we can discuss. But these church burnings are a problem happening right now. And I think it's really good that people are talking about them, especially when they bring in the conversation of the problems with residential schools as well. I cannot see what I have done wrong in discussing that. I also really want to point something out. When it comes to the church burnings, you seem really interested in ensuring we have found the culprits and ensuring we have proper convictions. Yet when it comes to the Catholic Church, you were just saying we should be outing the names of people who have been accused, not convicted. So why does your passion for justice and innocent until proven guilty exist for the church burnings, but not for the Catholic Church?
Sure. So that's not what I said. What I said was that should they release the records of the individuals who were involved in these churches, and whether or not those records
You
will
said
show.
accused.
Yeah, I said as in the records revolving around both the nuns and the priests who worked at those churches, those are records that the Catholic Church has not released. Whether or not those people turn out to be pedophiles is something that we can investigate, and whether or not those people will turn out to be criminals is another thing that we can talk about. The reason why I don't enjoy your particular brand of like pearl clutching when it comes to talking about these issues is that, yes, you did a half decent job at acknowledging, which I was surprised to see, the residential school system and the treatment of Indigenous people. When you twist things around and then you take this as an opportunity to say, and now we need to talk about the real issue, which happens to be these Catholic churches that are burning down, you are then trying to take away from the national conversation, which should be about the treatment of Indigenous people. If I was to compare the treatment of Catholics in Canada to the treatment of Indigenous Canadians, where do you think they would stack up? If I was to compare the treatment of the average white Catholic Canadian to the experience of the average Indigenous Canadian, where do you think we would end up? Who needs more help and who needs more concern right now in terms of the way they're being systemically oppressed between those two classes?
I wasn't comparing them. I was giving history and context as to why the outrage and conversation was happening in Canada, and then discussing how two wrongs don't make a right.
And that's the result
that.
of what you do. Because when you set those terms up, when you put them in that context, when you make those kind of videos, when you just ask questions, that's what ends up happening. And whether you're doing it consciously, I'm not sure. I don't know if you're doing it consciously or perhaps you're doing it unconsciously. I'm not sure, but that is the end result of your work. And when you make those kind of videos.
What is?
When you juxtapose two things like that, two opposing ideas, you set them up on the same terms, you make videos about them, and then suddenly it's going to be justifiable to think, well, the moral outrage should shift from this horrifying atrocity that has occurred and is still ongoing to Indigenous Canadians into
should I have not
we should now talk about Catholic churches and the burning of them down. That is the problem with your particular brand of content.
I think, and I guess it's maybe just my audience, but my audience have the ability to juggle two ideas at the same time. I can explain past atrocities and then say, here's also a present atrocity happening, and they can say, wow, those are both bad things. Like, I don't know about your audience, but my audience can juggle two things at the same time without an issue.
And it's with design, because by doing that, by pushing that narrative, they will be forced then to look at that and be like, well, you know what? I was a little bit upset about what was happening to Indigenous people, but I should be a lot more upset now at the Catholic churches that are burning down, because you've set it up that way.
So we shouldn't talk about the Catholic churches because it takes away from Indigenous issues.
You can talk about the Catholic churches. You should not juxtapose the two of them as if one is now going to be able to justify or accuse the other of being wrong.
That's not what I did, though. So how should I have made my video? Because what I did was I said, this is what happened at Indigenous residential schools. This is why it was bad, not a good thing. And then also there's this not a great thing happening today, and both things are bad. And we need to talk about it because it's happening right now. How should I have done that video differently? I feel like you're nitpicking and trying to find a problem with me because you didn't actually have an issue with that video, which is why you made up your issue in your response, which is that I was blaming natives, which I never did. Otherwise, you would have had an actual critique in your initial video.
Oh, I can answer that question quite easily. the information, I find it interesting that we've just glossed past the fact that these church burnings have actually been happening since long before the news was released. But in scouring through the information over the last, probably 2 years, trying to find church burnings, causes, whether or not there were investigations performed, I found one that was particularly funny to me, which was, it was a church that has burned in the same spot 3 separate times over the last 50 years. And it turned out that it was the area where the priests keep the incense and the anointing oil, because for some reason, I don't know why, this particular group of priests is just not aware that you probably shouldn't have an open flame next to flammable oil. And so this is the 5th time that the fire department has been called out. So I would have liked to see you discuss, for example, why it is that Canadian churches seem to be exempt from fire codes, or be aware that fire extinguishers have been invented.
That's fascinating, Tale. So your current assertion is that all the fucking churches that burned down in Canada over the past 2 years was accidental, and Catholic priests, on top of being fucking pedos and fucking Native American beaters, are fucking dog shit at fucking fire safety. That's what you want to contribute to this fucking conversation right now?
I'm contributing to you the facts as they stand. If you have a problem with the facts as they stand, that's your problem.
I have problems with the fucking facts, because you keep doing this meta conversation bullshit that has fucking nothing to do with what's going on. So tell me, because I am frustrated with you. What the fuck did you just add to the conversation by saying that maybe Catholic priests are accidentally burning down their own churches? Is that a serious contention that Lauren and I are supposed to take on earnestly? Do you think that we need to go back to fucking google.com right now and be real quick and be like, hey, what's the fucking fire codes of the fucking Vatican? Do they put out fucking fire safety briefs for the priests? Like, what the fuck am I supposed to research with that information?
Are you asking me for tips? And
no,
tricks?
I'm not, because I know you're shit posting and you're being an asshole for no fucking reason. Contribute to the fucking conversation or don't.
I'm identifying that the church fires preceded any announcement of these graves. And your assertion repeatedly is that there is some sort of...
So hold the fuck up. So if I take a look...
Why
the fuck are you taking my ball?
Connor, because I gotta let him at least finish if you want to respond to him. Okay. Tail, please finish.
I think Connor might need to take a break. But
do you want to finish? Okay.
I do this all the time, buddy.
I'm perfectly fine. I'm good. You can proceed.
What?
It's obviously very important to you.
It is.
Hey, Connor, you can go on.
See, thank you for the dog bowl, Dylan. Ding, ding. So fucking... All right. So you said that these church burnings happened in the past as well. If I was to Google church burnings and look at it statistically, do you think I would see an increase over the past 2 years?
I have absolutely no idea.
Then what the fuck are you talking about?
I would say probably. And come on, you don't have to be condescending in every single response you do to Tail. Come on. I mean,
then I want Tail to say something real.
I did, Connor. I said something real.
Okay, you said that Catholic priests are burning down their own churches by being assholes and putting incense in the wrong spot. That's what I heard. Is that your real contribution to this conversation?
If you have a problem with that fact, it is your problem to have.
Okay, I have a problem with that fact.
Well, then that's your problem to have.
Okay.
Question: Are Catholic priests also putting paint on the front of their churches and beheading their statues? Paint that says "Fight for," X progressive cause. I've literally seen the serfs tweeting out stuff that says, we were just Indigenous children. Are the Catholic priests putting that up on their church walls? Are they the ones doing that graffiti? That's been an exponential growth the last few months.
I'm more than willing to acknowledge that there's plenty of things that have been happening over the last 3 or 5 or 10 years that could be charted in any number of conceivable ways. But you haven't actually addressed what I said, which was these fires preceded the news.
Okay. Here, let me break this down for you really quickly. I was a former law enforcement officer, okay? We investigate things. When something picks up in a certain pattern, let's say that there's like one burglary in one area, and then it's just one burglary and then it happens. Okay, well, burglary happens. We try to investigate it. If we don't figure it out, then okay, whatever. If 20 burglaries occur in the same area within a month, there's probably a reason for it, so you can investigate it. And what I'm doing right now is I'm doing 1 + 1 = 2. And you're saying 1 is maybe a 0.5. so maybe it doesn't equal 2. And I have no idea what this adds to the conversation because we're literally light years ahead of where you're going.
I want to say this is not adding much to the conversation. Could we get back to the topic away from the fire incense theory?
Sure. Can I? Okay. I would like to ask a question from the serfs because basically
Sure.
I'm sure he could educate us
Wait.
and then we could have some contention.
Oh, Connor, can I let you ask? I just want to make one really like
to me again, Lauren.
2-second point. You'll like
again.
it. I promise. You know what? I'm willing to concede that fires happened before all these fires that happen now, and maybe it's just the fires continuing. But assault and rape existed before the residential schools, so you never know. All right, Connor, go ahead.
No, I can address that again. Yes, but again, assault and rape can exist before the residential schools, but these were forced upon the children. That's a huge difference.
It's almost like the context is different, right? Okay, go.
Yeah,
Connor.
and again, the same thing like Counterpoints brought up, right? He said there's rape that exists everywhere in society. It does. If you were forcing children to be in these institutions where 1 in 5 of them was getting sexually assaulted, then that is on you. That is on the Catholic Church. That is on the government of Canada.
Sure. Okay. So let's move the conversation forward because I would like to move forward instead of talking about incense burning. So basically what you were talking about, one of the major contentions that we were going to bring up tonight was whether or not the current actions of the Canadian government or the actions since 1996 constituted genocide. I watched your debate with Destiny. I liked it. I thought it was interesting. Oh, maybe it was a fan of yours. I'm sorry if I'm misattributing that to you.
Yeah, I was going to say I didn't debate Destiny on this topic.
Yeah, it was a fan of yours. But the thing that I found most compelling was that I felt like a lot of the issues that were brought up while trying to support the term of genocide with evidence were paralleled in the American system with Black Americans, right? And so what I would say is from a progressive lens, most people wouldn't say that the United States government is trying to genocide Black Americans. They would say that there's systemic issues that disproportionately affect the Black community, screw them over policing, war on drugs, all that kind of shit. But I think only a few people would use genocide. You seemed pretty confident in your assertion of the word genocide. So I would like to get your description and your evidence and maybe push back against it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so for the Articles of Genocide from the UN Convention, right? I'm pretty sure we all agree on Article E, forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. That's what the Canadian government has been involved with since the start of the residential schools. I mean, I believe that they kind of fall under most articles, causing serious or body or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. But the one that I'm sure we can all land upon and agree that Canada was committing was forcibly transferring children from one group to another group, right?
Sure. But let's say Lauren doesn't have to make this concession, but I'll make this concession. So let's say that there was a system to culturally genocide Native Canadians, Native Americans in Canada. But let's just say that even if it was considerably muted, it extended up until 1996. What about today? What
Absolutely.
about after 1996?
Sure.
Do you think constitutes genocide on behalf of the Canadian government?
Sure. So what occurred independently of the residential school system in Canada was something known as the 60 Scoop, which took place in about I believe, 1967 onward, in which 20,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families, and they were actually carted into buses, and they were sold to families in both the UK and the US, which also would constitute child trafficking. They were sold in forms of the terms for adoption. They were sold, and they were often placed within white families, and once again lost their Indigenous culture, language, all that kind of stuff. Many of the 60 Scoop children have grown up, and they've come back to tell their stories. There's multiple survivors of this event, and they've come forward to say that, yes, I was sold into adoption under the Canadian government. That is bad. But what is more important is that today we have a system in which the federal government of Canada, and this is really, really something that is important to keep in mind, they are the ones that oversee all public services on the reserves for First Nations children, as well as First Nations education. That falls under the purview of the federal government. So they are the ones who have to fund the conditions necessary for child welfare. Now, if you want to take away all the history of the reservation system in Canada, and if you didn't know already, the reserve system of Canada, which was enshrined into Canadian law under the Indian Act, basically took and placed a whole bunch of Indigenous cultures and put them into small spaces with deplorable living conditions, oftentimes far away from places. They were remote, they were away from Canadian society, they had a lot of difficulty getting work and all that kind of stuff because of those conditions. But even if you want to erase all of that and we take it forward to today, we live in a system now where we have an unbelievably high rate of Indigenous children in the foster care system. 50% of all the kids in the Canadian foster care system are Indigenous, despite being about 3% of the Canadian population. In Alberta, it's 73%. In Manitoba, it's 85%. And in Saskatchewan, it's 87%. Now, just for comparison, Canada has 1.1% of children in foster care compared to a country like Germany, which has 0.07%. Now, 2/3 of all the girls in foster care are abused, which is unfortunately deplorable. Children in the foster care system, if they're Indigenous, are 4 times more likely to be sexually molested than if they're not. And it continues to permeate. 60% of homeless youth, 1/3 of homeless adults were in the child care foster system. 91% of Indigenous female prisoners report having been physically or sexually abused. Women make up now 38% of prisoners in Canada. The majority of them were in the foster care system. Indigenous children make up 50% of all youth in correctional facilities. I could go on and on about all the ways these things permeate, but the difference would be, and this is one of the most comparable things I would say to someone who wants to compare this to, say, the Black American experience, is that these reserve systems were set up by the government of Canada. These reserve systems were set up and enshrined by the government of Canada. And so they set up the conditions in which they would have to support and enable children in these conditions in order to be able to assure for their welfare. What ended up happening, and this is the reason why this is a huge problem, is they began to underfund these systems. They have underfunded them by about 30% in comparing to their non-Indigenous counterparts. In the case of Ontario, they've underfunded them by about $400 million over the course of 5 years. So they are intentionally underfunding these systems that are then creating the poverty that is necessary for these kids to be justifiably taken from their parents in these systems.
Okay, so just so I can understand it descriptively, so I can try to understand your argument and wrap my head around it. So your argument is that, we're only a generation away from the residential school system. The systemic issues that are basically inherent in the res system, basically like lack of material resources, lack of education, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff.
Lack of clean drinking water.
Right, that causes broken families. Broken families are then contributing disproportionately to the foster care system, and then the foster care system is basically making it cyclical because they're producing fucked up adults that then in turn produce the cycle. And then my question is, because basically I think a lot of these arguments, while still fucked up, are analogous to our own perception of our foster care system inside the United States. The question that I have is, are you saying it's genocide because then it fits under that like UN subsection where it's the forcible removal of children, and it's kind of like this multivariable cycle that you're seeing? Is that why you're calling it genocide, or is there another reason?
Okay, so for me to make the assertion that this is still continuously ongoing cultural genocide, I would have to use the reference, again, we've been speaking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission multiple times. There's also the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report that came out that asserted the exact same thing, as well as the UN Human Rights Council that said that this is an ongoing crisis that tantamounts to genocide. Amnesty International has come out and declared the same terms in no uncertain words. It's not simply that they are intentionally, because they are intentionally underfunding these programs that is then creating this revolving door system. They are also specifically adopting Indigenous children at a higher rate despite the numbers. So if I am to compare Indigenous children to non-Indigenous children and the rates and the reasons why they are abducted for the adoption program, if you were to look at every single metric, non-Indigenous parents commit other atrocities such as physical abuse at a much higher rate than non-Indigenous parents. So for non-Indigenous parents, physical abuse occurs at 23% of the cases in which the kids are taken. In Indigenous families, it's only 9%. The same thing occurs for sexual abuse, emotional maltreatment, exposure to intimate partner violence. All of those across the board are either equal to or higher than with non-Indigenous families. The exception to the rule, and the only reason why Indigenous kids are apparently taken from their families at a much higher rate, is neglect. And neglect only registers at 16 points higher than non-Indigenous kids. So one of the biggest problems we have here is neglect as a broad term for being able to take these children away from their families is typically for a handful of reasons related to their living conditions. Their living conditions, which again are under the purview, especially when it comes to child welfare, of the federal government of Canada, who is intentionally paying them much lower rates than they are other families. They are creating the conditions in which this is occurring. Now, this, by the way, is not in and of itself. I wouldn't just walk away from this and be like, genocide, mic drop, you know, and then I've fucking done it. This is, again, one of many things that would be characterized in, say, if we were to look at the Truth and Reconciliation report, or any of the number of other reports that have come out, even the Royal Commission that came out in 1996, this is one of the biggest critical factors. If you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has stated that this is a genocide and that it is ongoing, they set out a whole bunch of calls to action specifically to address the fact that this is something that is ongoing and we need to stop this. And like you said, it was groundbreaking. I completely agree. I mean, it started in 2008 only because of a lawsuit cost $100 million, but their findings are critical. And the top numbers, if you read all the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the top numbers all talk about child welfare. They are the most important things to them because they are the ones that are critical for this ongoing process.
Do you mind if I jump in? All right.
Yep.
So you were just mentioning, and I would really have to look at the data, that within Indigenous families, at least in adoption, that the rates of abuse are lower, correct?
It depends on which categories. But for
Which
nearly
categories?
So for nearly every single category, for non-Aboriginal children, for physical abuse, it's higher. For sexual abuse, it's higher. For emotional maltreatment, it's the same. And for exposure to intimate partner violence, it's higher. All for non-Aboriginal families. The only case in which First Nations children are higher is neglect.
Okay, so first of all, I want to agree with you that the foster system is deeply messed up. You know, I've had family that have experienced it even just as non-Indigenous and almost died in it, right? It's a messed up system. It needs help in all regards. And if there is underfunding for Indigenous children in the system, that's something I'd absolutely support fixing. Now, is there a disparity, and you may have the data on this, is there a disparity in the amount of Indigenous kids versus non-Indigenous kids that are removed from their homes in the first place?
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly Indigenous kids.
And so, like, if I read the CBC or I go online, you can see, and I mean, you can disagree with this if you want, they'll talk about how there's higher drug use in these communities, higher incest and rape, neglect, these things in general. And this is not talking about just the foster care families. This is talking about the general population. And they say that it is because of the legacy of the residential school and things that they were taught while they were there, perhaps. But wouldn't it follow that if these things are happening in the community, that is why more kids are being put in the foster system? And I just, like, does that follow to you?
Yeah, so what you're trying to do is lay blame directly on, I guess, parents for their drug use.
No, I'm not
abuse.
trying to lay blame. I'm just trying to sort out why this is happening so that we can have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just asking questions. And in this case, it would be the overwhelming reason why they're being taken from their families, again, falls under neglect. Now, neglect can include parents who are using drugs. Neglect can include that. There's a number of reasons why they are taken from their families. In terms of the conditions on these reserves, and in terms of the conditions as to why they're, like, you have to understand these are deplorable environments. And yes, a lot of these people came back from the residential school system, and this has permeated the cycle of abuse. But these are also areas, there's 54 reserves, and this falls again under the government of Canada, that don't have drinking water. They don't have potable drinking water. Like, the very essence of life, and I'm not trying to become emotional or anything here and try to appeal to emotion, but I'm saying that that is a critical aspect of living in these environments. And that is why this may perpetuate and create conditions in which you will find families who are broken. In addition to, many of these families have also been given ultimatums in which, if you wish to receive treatment, if you wish to receive any kind of, let's just say, compensation, if you wish to receive financial aid, you may have to put up your children for adoption in order to receive that money. That was something else that came out of the commission. So I don't know how else to explain this other than a lot of this does fall under, like, you can chalk up a handful of this to personal responsibility, and I'm not going to try and absolve anyone from personal responsibility. That's not my purpose here. I'm trying to say, how much is the government of Canada themselves accountable in this equation? And if the government of Canada and things like, again, clean drinking water is responsible on behalf of the government of Canada, it was a promise made by Justin Trudeau. He said he would fix that, and we still have 54 different reserves that don't even have clean drinking water. then that falls under them. If they're intentionally withdrawing or withholding or suing families in order to withhold the money that is owed to them to help their child welfare, that is on the government of Canada. I'm sorry, counterpoints.
Yeah, counterpoints. You can go.
Yeah, so this is actually where listen, I'm not like the other girls, okay? I'm an enlightened centrist. So this is where I seriously think that the right and left could come together. And I hate to say that, but I'm going to, even though this is a debate. So when you're talking about conservative values, conservative Christian values, I know that makes some people catch on fire and cringe to death and all that kind of stuff. Oftentimes, one of the primary things that's emphasized is strong families. Strong families come from a strong environment. So if you literally, like at least for me, if I was arguing with conservatives, I would say, listen, you're born through no fault of your own. Your parents are addicted to drugs. You don't have access to good food, good water, good education, good anything. And then it's basically up to you to bootstrap. Now, can you bootstrap? Sure. Everybody, some people are fucking Ben Carson, right? They can become a neurosurgeon despite thinking that like grain was stored in the fucking pyramids or some shit like that, right? Some people can bootstrap. But some people can't. And then on top of that, shitty conditions basically decreases your ability to bootstrap. So for me, what I would say is there's variables that we can control. There's variables that we can't. And we have to control the variables that we can. But what I would want, because basically what maybe genocide for me is too strong of a term, maybe that grants some immediacy to the issue that allows it to be addressed politically. But at the same time, like I see this shit not as a single generational project. I see this as like a century-long project, literally. And by that, I mean making schools that aren't dog shit, early education, and then basically raising productive adults. Now, my definition of productive is probably way different than anybody on the left's, but at the same time, like that's where I think there's a real opportunity here. The reason why I think I came into this conversation pretty strong and I was like, fuck yeah, let me do this conversation, is because when I hear that we have like fucked up systems, not enough water, not enough food, not good education, I don't think genocide. Now, whether or not we can move past that shit and just start focusing on solutions instead of calling each other assholes, I don't know. Like calling each other assholes on Twitch.tv is fucking fun. I love it. But at the same time, like, I don't know, strong families make strong children make strong families.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Dylan.
Quick, yeah, but I do want to say we are speeding towards the end. We have about 5 minutes left until where the conversation was listed to end. So I just wanted to ask the room if you wanted to end it here or if you wanted to keep it going. I could go for maybe another 10 minutes max.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I need to wrap up soon too.
If I could just add two things, I guess I spent too much time talking.
Can we do it in closing, or do you think we can? Would that be difficult? Or
sure. Well, our closing statement is certainly about 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll give it about 5. I'll give 5
How about,
minutes left since we.
Okay. All right.
And so I'll have you go and I'll have Lauren go. Lauren, you were gonna go first, so Lauren then serfs. Sound good? Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, I first wanted to mention I do not think a lack of clean drinking water leads to parents having sex with their kids, and that is a larger problem that we're going to have to address. That can't be addressed just, okay, give people money, fix the infrastructure in a town, right? Yeah, we can all agree that fixing the infrastructure is good, but this also brings up a whole opens a can of worms of there are people in the Indigenous community in Canada who don't even want to be a part of the laws of Canada, who feel that's an aspect of cultural genocide, who feel that the government having any sort of decisions on their land is a part of cultural genocide. So then to balance this issue with, okay, you also need to build the infrastructure here, you also need to ensure the conditions are good on our land, but also we don't want to be a part of Canada, that creates a really difficult contention and problem we're dealing with here. And of course, we're not going to have time for it in this debate here, but I do think that is something that should be considered.
Lance?
So I just want to quickly say counterpoints. If you have more interest in this, because I think you do have productive interest in this topic, I would recommend also checking out the inquiry into the murdered and missing Indigenous women, which speaks pretty highly also to the eugenics program that was instilled in Canada and the forced sterilization that is still occurring to Indigenous women today. As recently as 2018, nearly 100 women, I believe, in Saskatchewan, or no, 100 women over the last decade, but I think 18 women in Saskatchewan have begun lawsuits against the provincial government's healthcare program for experiencing forced sterilization. There has been numerous cases across this country of this occurring, and specifically occurring in much higher rates to Indigenous women, typically under the guise of them not being mentally sound or mentally fit, and often under duress in that they cannot receive their own children after being born unless they sign away the rights to be forcibly sterilized. So that's one of the aspects of it that will be present, obviously, in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women document. There's a number of other reasons, though. I mean, I didn't have the time to get into it now, but the conditions that are being set up in these reserves that are being perpetuated, the fact that the government of Canada did not even want to give money in return to these reserves because they were dramatically underfunding it until like class action lawsuit was taken up by Cindy Blackstock, which ended up rewarding, I believe, close to like $2 billion, which the government of Canada is still fighting in court to try and withdraw them from having. This is like, there's so many things that once you stack them upon each other, it's the reason why it's not just myself. You know, this is again something that has been recognized by Amnesty International, the UN Human Rights Panel. And again, one of the last things I'll say on this, especially regarding the forced sterilization of women, the International Conference of the United Nations Human Rights Commission held in Montreal stated in March 1999 that Canada is in violation of international law in its treatment of Aboriginal people, and that the condition of Natives is the most pressing human right issue to Canadians. It is tantamount to their genocide. So
Okay, so we're now going to go into closing statements and shout outs. Please do shout yourself out in your closing statements. Thank you all for attending tonight's conversation. I appreciate your well-being. Sorry for all my viewers on my side about the stream crashing. You know, things happen. It was probably the Canadian CIA. You know how it works. We're going to throw it over to... is that what it's called? CSIS?
it's called CSIS. Everything's lamer in Canada.
Wow, including the debates. Now we're going to throw it over to Connor.
Yeah, my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. I'm a center-right, law enforcement veteran, Marine Corps veteran, science fiction, religion, and philosophy nerd. I do like debates like this. Sorry to Tale of Twin Rabbit for being a dick, but sorry you frustrated me a little bit. And then basically, I know everybody was expecting a fucking bloodbath, and maybe we failed that a little bit. But that's because, like, I don't know, I give a shit. We're talking about people who are being, like, ultimately at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not we call it genocide, we're talking about people who were raped and murdered. We are talking about kids who ran away from their homes and died of exposure. All of this shit is fucked up. So we can talk about the reason why I wanted to enforce descriptive reality is because I've said this before, I'll say this again, is some of the way this stuff is portrayed, I would be probably acting not in the most rational way possible. The reason why I want to nail down descriptive reality of the past, the reason why I want to nail down descriptive reality of the present, is because I think accurate descriptive reality can get you to better prescriptive solutions. So maybe we can talk about that another time. I sincerely appreciate y'all, and I wish you all well.
Okay, now I'm going to throw it over to Lauren Southern.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me, first of all, Dylan. I know it was a bit controversial. So, firstly, to assert that there is a genocide occurring, to assert that there were mass graves found, out of all of the graves that were allegedly found that have been in the media the last few months, not a single body has been exhumed. Not one. And even so, this doesn't mean there aren't necessarily graves or a graveyard, but all of the chiefs in these communities have stated these are not mass graves if they do exist and they do know about them. The 751 graves found, the Cowessess band, Chief Cadmus Delorme, emphasized that the findings were not from a mass grave, but unmarked graves. The band leader in Kelowna said it was not a mass grave for the 215 graves found there, or potentially. The GPR researchers that did this research said nothing is confirmed until things are dug up. Yet progressive activists and media continue to make the claim of mass graves, and so do our debate opponents, exaggerating what were some potentially absolutely horrific things that happened in the past. And we need to be honest about what has occurred to have a proper conversation while not exaggerating. And unfortunately, this exaggeration has led to legitimate hate crimes and destruction today, and that is unfortunate, and especially unfortunate that people are making excuses for it.
Okay, now I'm going to throw it over to Tale of Two Rabbits.
Thank you very much. I don't know. I'm unclear. Academics, historians, indigenous nations, government agencies, they've been open about this genocide for decades. The Truth and Reconciliation Report was issued 6 years ago. The concession was made that these fires aren't somehow all a conspiracy of Antifa. The concession was made that the mass graves are being identified and require further research. The concede was made that the foster care system is absolutely toxic and therefore the removal policy was unacceptable. And in response, I got rhetorical tactics and a fair amount of shouting because this was fun. Fully mature people learn from their mistakes and move forward. Fully mature people own up to their past. Fully mature people acknowledge that sometimes a priest can accidentally set fire to his own church rather than scream at the person who says that it happened. When members of my community learned that I'd agreed to participate in this, they were appalled. I hope they at now least kind of partially understand why I did.
Okay. Before we throw it over to Lance to wrap it up, I just want to let everybody know that tomorrow we have the Hippie Dippy Roundtable on my show for this Friday. And next week, I had to reschedule due to today's technical difficulties my review of Tariq Nasheed's new movie, Buck Breaking, with Your Movie Sucks, which should be happening hopefully some point next week. Now we're going to throw it over to Lance to wrap it up.
Yeah, I don't think there can be any restorative justice as long as the people responsible aren't taking claims for the actions they've done. If I could use a simile, it's kind of like you, Lauren Southern, because ultimately, if you had spent your career rising to become one of the darling children of the alt-right, palling around with people like Brittany Pettibone, Richard Spencer, touring around the globe with someone like, let's say, Stefan Molyneux, who is well known for measuring the skulls of black and white people, spreading the Great Replacement conspiracy, spreading the Great Genocide conspiracy theory, then going on tour spreading both of those conspiracy theories, in addition to going to join that far-right nationalist group, first Europa, and then joining them by shooting flares at immigrants, and doing all of this while at the same time all of it bubbles over and boils over to the point where at the end of the day you ultimately led to one of the people contributing towards the Christchurch shooting, who declared that the Great Replacement theory was one of the reasons why they committed the atrocity that they did. Afterwards, you then took everything back.
Pussy. You
Afterwards,
fucking pussy.
you took
Bringing this
everything
all
back.
up at the end so I don't have a chance to respond.
You can respond.
wait.
I'm more than
bitch,
glad.
you're lying.
More than glad.
Okay.
More than glad. I would love. Please bring it all up. Bring it all
Can
up.
I just
Lauren.
say? Wait. You can respond, but let me just be clear. I am not going to be part of it. If you want to make this into a fucking shit show, I'm leaving, and I will not contribute to that because that's not the type of brand I want to produce. Do you both understand that? Okay, Lance, finish, and then I'm out, and you two can fucking eat each other alive if you want.
Sounds good.
Lance, okay. Lance, you gonna finish?
Yeah. I'll finish. And then turning the whole thing around to suddenly say that you're going to rebrand yourself as this wonderful new centrist and everything's wonderful and that you write children's books now and it's all ooh-woo and everything's good now and nothing bad ever happened. I think if you wanted to achieve restorative justice when it came all of this stuff, then what you had to do was simply acknowledge any of the bad things you've done in the past, but you haven't. So I don't think the idea of you now doing this rebranding tour is anything more than you just seeing the writing on the wall. That's ultimately what this all is. You knew what was happening to your peers, and you were smart enough and astute enough to walk away from it.
You're such a bitch, Lance.
Okay.
Bring it up.
Well,
Let's go. Let's go. Talk to me. I'm staying right here. I'm not going anywhere.
Oh yeah, throw 7,000 accusations at me and then ask me to respond to them. That's great. Connor and I are going to have a chat with my chat. And if you want to not be a bitch boy and have a full conversation another time, we can do that. And we'll arrange that.
Okay. You all have a pleasant afternoon.
I'm right here, Lauren. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to go talk to Connor.